we turn our spotlight tonight on MSNBC's chief correspondent, Ali Velshi. The Canadian journalist, he has a new book ahead of this year's U.S. election. It details the 91 criminal counts against Donald Trump. Here's part of our conversation. And Ali Velshi joins me now from New York City. Ali, good to see you.
Travis, it's great to be with you.
Listen, you know, I know that you left Canada back in, I think it was the early 2000s, 2001 if I'm not mistaken. Tell me what that draw to the U.S. was for you.
Well, you know, it was less of a draw and more of a what do you do when it actually happens. I had a few colleagues who had gone to work in the United States. I loved being in Toronto. I loved being in Canadian media. I wasn't really looking for it, and I think that I had to talk myself into it to say, hey, you know, we sort of think that this is a good opportunity. It was CNN that called up, and I came down to try and do the same things I was doing in Canada. Little did I know, and it wasn't so different in 2001, how different the media market and the political market would turn out to be in the United States. You know, back then I was a business and economics journalist, and some days I wish I still was. It would be a simpler time than some of the things we have to deal with now every day in the news. So I miss it a lot. I came here for the adventure because that's the kind of guy I was. If somebody offered me an adventure anywhere, I would have taken it, and so I did, and I'm glad for it. And I love New York, and I love the people I work with and things here. But there's not a day when I don't think back to Canada. There's not a day when I don't just check where my passport is and make sure and give it a nice little run.
Well, listen, there's two things that I want to pick up on that you said there. Well, your time as a business reporter, but first, you know, going down to the United States, what were the differences that you were confronted with immediately being a journalist here as opposed to in the U.S.?
Well, look, I think on one hand, it's the resources, right? One of the beauties of Canadian journalists and why so many of them do so well in the United States is because we have tended to do more with less a long time ago in Canada. That's now happening in American media, in American cable. People are being asked to produce more content with fewer resources. But as Canadians, we were used to that. So I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the quality of Canadian journalism. Back when I moved to the United States, CNN was still a product heavily influenced by Ted Turner, who, while never a journalist, was really somebody who did a lot for journalism. But over time, media has become much more polarized, as has society and politics in the United States, and sadly to some degree in Canada, but not the degree to which it is in the United States. And that was the thing that was hardest to come to terms with. Growing up in Toronto, I didn't have that sense that people identified with their political party or their political positions. It felt more like people lived amongst each other and when asked, talked about politics, and during elections talked about politics. But by 2000 and 2001, America had become a much more polarized place, certainly not as much as it is today, but that was the thread that I started seeing come unraveled when I moved here.
You mentioned you started as a business journalist, and you were one in 2008. How much of a responsibility did you feel during the financial crisis to provide people with sound financial information?
Well, I had a great boss at the time who called me in after one of those very early days in the financial crisis when the market had tumbled triple digits, and he said, "It's very loud out there. People will read you and your panic and your excitement the wrong way if you don't really curate that very well. People are looking to you to make decisions, and if you scare them, they might make some very bad decisions. So why don't you make it your business to just, as calmly as possible, you know, from a perspective of just presenting the facts, let people understand what's going on." And I took that to heart, and I realized that good information was more important than conveying excitement and panic or threat. And it really helped. It helped me. It helped me learn things. It helped me get the right people to explain to me what was going on, and I passed that on to my viewers. But it became sort of my signature at that point. I decided it's more important for me to tell you what's going on than to tell you what I think about what's going on.
I want to talk to you about the last U.S. election, because I understand that you traveled across the country talking to regular Americans.
Yeah.
Tell me some of the things that you learned by doing that.
I learned that it's very hard to have a conversation with people who are on different sides of an issue if they're not working off the same set of facts. That was the most difficult thing. I was traveling around during COVID. I was traveling around after the murder of George Floyd, and people just had their own facts, and they still do. And that's the part that really troubles me, because things have only become more serious, and it does appear that every time there's an important issue out there, within moments, people have been caused to take a position on it and perhaps change their symbols on their social media. What I would really love to do is bring the slow food movement into the news, the slow news movement, the idea that instead of having a hot take on something or making a fast decision, what if I take this opportunity to really lean into something and learn about it? What if my icon, my avatar on social media indicates to you that I don't know much about this topic, so I'm going to learn and I'm going to discuss. That's the part that I found difficult. People identified with a place on the political spectrum, and then they would find out how they were supposed to think about COVID or police shootings or climate change or whatever the case is, as opposed to saying, hey, let me learn about this and discuss it. So I really loved being out there with Americans and having those conversations. I still do, and I still do love it. But we spend a lot of time disagreeing on what the facts are, as opposed to disagreeing on opinions about those facts.
Well, I know that you did a TED Talk back in, I think it was 2017, about disinformation, and I wonder how much worse you think that phenomenon is now in 2024 than it was in 2017.
I was such a naive innocent back then when I thought that disinformation was a really neat way for people to monetize it, to make money off of nonsense that was on the internet. That was long before I realized what would happen, what social media would end up doing, and what, how disinformation would be wielded by the world's authoritarians and dictators and some mainstream politicians. I was onto something back then. The speech made sense, and it ages well. I just wasn't on to how influential it would be and how uncritical we would be as recipients of disinformation. And it comes down to that. Having covered stories all over the world, it's the same problem everywhere. It's not that people can't get the right information, even if you're in Russia. Everybody's got a VPN in Russia. You can get broader information than the censored stuff that comes to you on TV. People choose not to. And I think, Travis, that's the thing we have to most think about with our kids, to be able to say, for all the things you have to learn in school, you've got to learn critical thinking. You've got to learn how to consume media. You've got to learn how to protect yourself against the nonsense that is moving at a velocity that one's brain can't even compute.
Yeah, well, it takes me to the next question, which is about quote-unquote legacy media, which CBC is part of, MSNBC, NBC is part of as well. And there's been criticism in this country of legacy media leaning in one political direction or the other. MSNBC gets that all the time. It leans too far left. What do you make of that assessment?
Sure. The assessment I have of that is that political leanings are not actually our problem in society. Lying is our problem. Misinformation and disinformation is our problem. I would be most pleased to listen to anybody's opinion on what's going on from wherever they are in the political spectrum, if I can rely on the fact that it's accurate, that it's presented in good faith, that it is what the presenter believes to be their truth or their opinion. That's where we get mixed up. I'm totally fine with opinion. I think people should be able to say, I want to get a very conservative opinion on this issue or a very liberal opinion on that issue, but I want it to be trustworthy. The thing that we have to do in the media is we have to make sure that when we say something, it can be relied upon. At MSNBC, regardless of leanings of some of our prospective hosts, and many of our hosts are not prospective hosts, they're news hosts, but despite the political leanings of prospective hosts like myself, we have the same standards department that NBC News has. We have the same legal department. We can't lie to our viewers. That's the danger. Lying is where the danger comes in, not the political opinion.
So, in this world that we are in right now, where there is social media, where there is legacy media, where people can consume their news from whatever source they want, TikTok or Instagram, or, turning on cable, how do you get through to viewers in terms of, making sure that they are getting reliable sources of news when there is so much out there?
Yeah, and add to what you just said, we now have these AI threats, right?
Exactly.
The things that show up in your feed that are actually not true. What we have to do is we have to deliver, or at least I have to try to deliver news in a fashion that cause people to understand the context behind the story. In other words, I'm trying to get away from the hot takes. I'm trying to get my viewers away from thinking that it's important to hear somebody who's got a take on everything that happened fairly immediately. The idea should be, let me understand the context. And it might cause me to want to read the book written by the person who I've just interviewed on my show. So the more complicated the world gets, the faster it moves, and the more unreliable news and information can get for my viewers, the more I rely on this slowing down and saying, let me set the table for you. Right. You can eat with whoever you want. You can eat whatever you want, but let me set the table for you so you've got the tools to get through the meal. That's what matters here. No matter what story we're talking about, whether it's Donald Trump or it's the Middle East or it's Russia and Ukraine, what people need is context to be able to say, did what I just hear fit in from the context that I understand to be true? That's what I hope people sort of come to me for.
Let's talk about the race for the White House. And, age has been a factor in this race. What did you make of that news conference that we saw after the special counsel report with President Biden, and how the age argument seems to stick when it comes to him, but it doesn't stick when it comes to the former U.S. president?
It's a very unusual situation. They're not that far apart in age. You'll notice that Joe Biden is at his best when he's riffing, when he's impromptu, when he's talking about topics. I mean, he was in Congress and the Senate for so long, when he's talking about topics that he knows so deeply that he doesn't have to rely on a teleprompter. Donald Trump presents entirely differently. Donald Trump grabs the energy of the audience. I had a reporter say to me the other day on air that everybody should go to a Donald Trump rally just to understand the electric nature of it, what actually happens at one of those things. That's not who Joe Biden is. So the net result is people see Donald Trump, for better or worse, regardless of your politics, people see Donald Trump as energy incarnate, and they don't see Joe Biden as that. As for that special counsel report, the main criticism is that he sort of went outside of his remit. His remit was to determine whether there were charges to be laid and crimes that had been committed, and sort of went into a much larger issue about Joe Biden's mental faculties, of which people said maybe that should have been left to somebody whose specialty is determining whether somebody's fitness for trial or their job. So you're right. It definitely manifests very differently when people talk about Joe Biden than it does when people talk about Donald Trump.
Do you think age is going to continue to be a factor here in this election cycle, and how do you think that will play out?
I think this plays mostly to people who already have their minds up. So if you made up, in other words, if you're a Joe Biden supporter, there aren't that many people who aren't decided. So if you're a Joe Biden supporter, you're going to say, hey, don't look at his age, look at his experience, look at what he's done with the last 50 years of his life, and the things that he's built, and the things that he fought Russia off from taking over Ukraine. And if you're a Donald Trump supporter, you're going to say, look at this guy, he can't remember basic facts. I don't know that it moves a whole lot of people in the middle. It's not nothing, but I think it'll continue to be an issue. I will say, Travis, the interesting thing is that I, on a weekly basis, interview so many remarkable young elected people in this country. There are so many of them that there's generally a feeling that the major political parties haven't done what they needed to do to motivate those people. They're big tents, but they're not big enough to make young people feel like they're in the game and moving quickly. That might be the bigger problem, because if young people can't connect with the candidates and the political parties, they may not connect with the process. They think a lot of things are wrong with society, including climate and social justice issues, but if they're not feeling motivated to go out and vote, they might not. And that is something that, the Republican Party's got a lot of struggles right now, so they've got a lot of things to figure out. But the Democratic Party does need to think about the fact that they are, some polls show losing support amongst the young.
You wrote the introduction to the Trump indictments, a book that compiles the indictments against Donald Trump. How troubling is it to you that, we've seemingly got used to these alleged crimes by the former president?
It's wild. It's completely normalized. I mean, it's amazing. It's a book. It started because I recorded them as a podcast. Didn't know how that would go. Turns out a lot of people wanted to hear those indictments read. It's a little bit hard. It's legal reading. Then we put them into a book, mostly so that people can kind of give it to other people who say, you know, it's fine. It's not that big a deal. He didn't break anything. Nothing's been charged. Nothing's been determined. It is important to see the detail, particularly in two of the cases, the two that are the most important, and that is Jack Smith's January 6th election interference case and Fani Willis's Georgia election interference case. The details, the text, the communications with people. Again, I'm not a juror in any of those cases. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not equipped to determine the outcome. It is important to read so that one understands what's actually underway right now. Because come November, Americans are going to have some serious decisions to make about their future, and while age and things like that are important to consider, it has never been the case that someone has run for election in the United States facing this many charges. We'll know by November whether any of those charges will have been decided.
Right, but it helps him fundraise. It helps him at rallies with his supporters.
Sure.
Do you think politically there's going to be any fallout for him when it comes to these legal woes?
I think on the margins, Travis, I think, again, there aren't that many people in the middle. But for those who are in the middle, understanding, hearing, or seeing in some cases, depending on which trial we're talking about, the allegations read, the same thing happened when Donald Trump's lawyers, and he was in court arguing before the circuit court in D.C. about whether he's immune from charges. For people to hear his lawyers say that if Donald Trump activated SEAL Team 6 to murder an adversary, he would be immune from charges, that's when the penny drops for a lot of people. That's why these cases are important. That's to understand that we are really on two different planets here.
I want to bring it back to your home country, Canada. You said before that American politics are really in a bad place right now, and you look back at Canada fondly as an escape hatch in case politics gets too bad. But a lot of people here in Canada say that this country is adopting American-style politics. Do you see that? And does that make you feel like Canada's less of a safe haven, perhaps?
Well, the beauty of being nostalgic is it's nostalgia, right? I remember what I remember, and it wasn't that when I left. Obviously, it's changed, and I definitely have a lot of Canadians tell me the Canada you're thinking about is not exactly where we are today. And I remind people that the Canada that I'm thinking about is still well within the realm of the Canada that exists today. I'm not nostalgic for the past. I'm not one of these guys who thinks things shouldn't change and shouldn't develop and move on. I do think civility in politics. I do think bipartisanship or tripartisanship is something that we should value and we should want. I do think pluralism is something that Canada has done tremendously well, and you don't have to explain it to anyone. If anybody doesn't know that word, all you have to do is drop them in Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary or so many other places in Canada. I think Canada gets a lot of things right. Some of that is legacy. It's because we got a lot of things right in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. We get immigration a lot better. Are there problems? Absolutely. But I am seeing American-style media influence on politics in Canada, including with that truckers' protest that we saw. Didn't make any sense. It wasn't an answer to particular issues that were going on in the country. It was fueled by external sources. It was fueled by disinformation. I see that happening more and more. I see the appeal to populism occurring more and more. I only send it as a warning to my friends and family north of the border. It's not a good idea. Once you go there, it's like getting into quicksand. It's very hard to pull yourself out. You can, and I think we will in America. I hope we will. But before Canada steps in the quicksand, I would suggest everybody think this through several times.
Ali, listen, I know you got to get back to work, so we will let you do that. Certainly appreciate the time here tonight on Canada Tonight, and pop by anytime you're in Toronto.
I absolutely will, Travis.